Hi, this is Miss Erica Johnson, and I'm actually going to go over Chapter 3 of And Then There Were None. I'm actually going to read this chapter and then also give a few comments. And so if the homework was to read Chapter 3 last week, and either you have not done so or you just need some advice about what Chapter 3 is about, you need a review, this would be an excellent video to watch and listen to as I go through Chapter 3. So, here we go. Dinner was drawing to a close. The food had been good, the wine perfect. Rogers waited well. Every one was in better spirits. They had begun to talk to each other with more freedom and intimacy. Mr. Justice Wargrave, mellowed by the excellent port, was being amusing in caustic fashion. Dr. Armstrong and Tony Marston were listening to him. Miss Brent chattered to General MacArthur, and they discovered some mutual friends. Vera Claythorne was asking Mr. Davis intelligent questions about South Africa. Mr. Davis was quite fluent on the subject. Lombard listened to the conversation. Once or twice he looked up quickly and his eyes narrowed. Now and then his eyes played around the table, studying the others. Anthony Marston said suddenly, "Quaint, these things, aren't they?" In the center of the round table, on a circular glass stand, were some little china figures, Indians. Now, in our book that we're reading in class, it does refer to the figures in the middle of the table as soldiers. And so, like I've said in class, in the book we're reading, they have changed from referring to the figurines and the island even from Indian in what we're reading online. In the book, it's referred to as Soldier Island, and then there's little toy soldier figurines in the middle of the table. So there is a difference, but in the text, but they're the same thing. Okay. Vera leaned forward. "I wonder, how many are there? 10? Yes, 10 there are." Vera cried, "What fun! They're 10 little Indian boys of the nursery rhyme, I suppose. In my bedroom the rhyme is framed and hung over the mantelpiece." Lombard said, "In my room, too. And mine. And mine." Everybody joined in the chorus, Vera said. "It's an amusing idea, isn't it?" So we find out here that in each bedroom there is a poem hanging on the wall of the 10 little Indian boys. And this is the poem that we read in class. It's in the front of your book even. Mr. Justice Wargrave grunted, "Remarkably childish," and helped himself to port. Port is a type of wine. Emily Brent looked at Vera Claythorne. Vera Claythorne looked at Miss Brent. The two women rose. In the drawing-room the French windows were open to the terrace, and the sound of the sea murmuring against the rocks came up to them. Emily Brent said, "Pleasant sound." Vera said sharply, "I hate it." Miss Brent's eyes looked at her in surprise. Vera flushed. She said more composedly, "I don't think this place would be very agreeable in a storm." Emily Brent agreed. "I've no doubt the house is shut up in the winter," she said. "You never get servants to stay here, for one thing." Vera murmured, "It must be difficult to get servants anyways." Emily Brent said, "Mrs. Oliver has been lucky to get these two. The woman's a good cook," Vera thought. "Funny how elderly people always get names wrong," she said. "Yes, I think Mrs. Owen has been very lucky indeed." Emily Brent had brought a small piece of embroidery out of her bag, and now as she was about to thread her needle she paused. She said sharply, "Owen? Did you say Owen?" "Yes," Emily Brent said sharply. "I've never met anyone called Owen in my life." Vera stared. "But surely—" She did not finish her sentence. The door opened and the men joined them. Rogers followed them into the room with a coffee tray. The judge came and sat down by Emily Brent. Armstrong came up to Vera. Tony Marston strolled to the open window. Blore studied with naive surprise a statuette in brass, wondering perhaps if its bizarre angularities were really supposed to be female figure. General MacArthur stood with his back to the mantelpiece, and he pulled at his little white mustache. That had been a fine good dinner. His spirits were rising. Lombard turned over the pages of Punch that lay with the other papers on the table by the wall. Rogers went around with the coffee tray, and the coffee was good, really black, very hot. The whole party had dined well. They were satisfied with themselves and with life. The hands of the clock pointed to 20 minutes past 9. There was a silence, a comfortable, replete silence. Into the silence came the voice, without warning, inhuman, penetrating. "Ladies and gentlemen, silence, please." Everyone was startled. They looked around at each other, at the walls. Who was speaking? The voice went on, a high, clear voice. "You are charged with the following indictments. Edward George Armstrong, that you did upon the 14th day of March, 1925, cause the death of Louisa May Cleese, Mary Cleese. Emily Caroline Brent, that upon the 5th November, 1931, you were responsible for the death of Beatrice Taylor. William Henry Bloor, that you brought about the death of James Stephen Landor on October 10, 1928. Vera Elizabeth Clayhorn, that on 11th day of August, 1935, you killed Cyril Ogilvie Hamilton. Philip Lombard, that upon a date in February 1932, you were guilty of the death of 21 men, members of an East African tribe. John Gordon MacArthur, that on the 4th of January 1917, you deliberately sent your wife's lover, Arthur Richmond, to his death. Anthony James Marston, that upon the 14th day of November last, you were guilty of the murder of John and Lucy Combs. Thomas Rogers and Ethel Rogers, that on the 6th of May you brought about the death of Jennifer Brady, and Lawrence Wargrave, that upon the 10th day of June you were guilty of the murder of Edward Seaton. Prisoners at the bar, have you anything to say in your defense? The voice had stopped. There was a moment of petrified silence, and then a resounding crash. Rogers had dropped the coffee tray. At the moment, from somewhere outside the room, there came a scream, the sound of a thud. Lombard was the first to move. He leapt to the door and flung it open. Outside, laying in the huddled mass, was Miss Rogers. Lombard called, "Marston!" Anthony sprang to help him. Between them they lifted the woman and carried her into the drawing-room. Now, at this point, you have found out this suspicious path, supposedly, by all of the characters of something they have done and the dates they did it on. And we're wondering, are these things true? Are there really 10 murderers here on the island? Have they committed these deeds? What are these voices? As good readers, you would be asking yourselves these questions as you're reading. Now we know that Miss Rogers was in another room and has passed out, and the men go to try to help her. So I'm going to pick back up around Dr. Armstrong right here. Dr. Armstrong came across quickly. He helped them to lift her onto the sofa and bent over. He said quickly, "It's nothing. She fainted, that's all. She'll be around in a minute." Lombard said to Rogers, "Get some brandy." Rogers, his face white, his hands shaking, murmured, "Yes, sir," and slipped out of the room. Vera cried out, "Who is that speaking? Who was he? It sounded. General MacArthur sputtered out, "What's going on here? What kind of practical joke was that?" His hand was shaking. His shoulders sagged. He looked suddenly 10 years older. Bloor was mopping his face with a handkerchief. Only Mr. Justice Wargrave and Miss Emily Brent seemed comparatively unmoved. Emily Brent sat upright, her head held high, and both cheeks was a spot of hard color. The judge sat in his habitual pose, his head sunk down into his neck, and with one hand he gently scratched his ear. Only his eyes were active, darting around and round the room, puzzled, alert with intelligence. Again, it was Lombard who acted. Armstrong being busy with the collapsed woman, Lombard was free once more to take the initiative. He said, "That voice! It sounded as though it were in the room." Vera cried, "Who was it? Who was it? It wasn't any one of us." Like the judge, Lombard's eyes wandered slowly around the room, and they rested a minute at the open window. Then he shook his head decisively. Suddenly his eyes lighted up. He moved forward swiftly to where a door near the fireplace led into an adjoining room. With a swift gesture he caught the handle and flung the door open. He passed through and immediately uttered an exclamation of satisfaction. He said, "Ah, here we are!" The others crowded after him. Only Miss Brent remained alone, sitting erect in her chair. Inside the second room a table had been brought up close to the wall which adjoined the drawing-room, and on the table was a gramophone, an old-fashioned type with a large trumpet attached. The mouth of the trumpet was against the wall, and Lombard pushing it aside indicated where 2 or 3 small holes had been unobtrusively bored through the wall. A gramophone is almost like a record player that will play different types of, records or pieces that you place on a spindle and it spins around and plays either a recording of some sort or a song. Adjusting the gramophone, he replaced the needle on the record and immediately heard it again. "You are charged with the following indictments." Vera cried, "Turn it off, it's horrible." Lombard obeyed. Dr. Armstrong said with a sigh of relief, "A disgraceful and heartless practical joke, I suppose." The small, clear voice of Mr. Justice Wargrave murmured, "So you think it's a joke, do you?" The doctor stared at him. What else could it be? The hand of the judge gently stroked his upper lip. He said, "At the moment, I'm not prepared to give an opinion." Anthony Marston broke in. "Look here, there's one thing you've forgotten. Who the devil turned the thing on and set it going?" Wargrave murmured, "Yes, I think we must inquire into that." He led the way back into the drawing-room. The others followed. Rogers had just come in with a glass of brandy. Miss Brent was bending over the moaning form of Mrs. Rogers. Adroitly, Rogers slipped between the two women. "Allow me, madam, I'll speak to her. Ethel, it's all right, do you hear? Pull yourself together." Mrs. Rogers' breath came in quick gasps. Her eyes stared frightened eyes, went around and round the ring of faces. There was urgency in Rogers' tone. "Pull yourself together, Ethel." Dr. Armstrong to her soothingly. "You'll be all right now, Mrs. Rogers. Just a nasty turn." She said, "Did I faint, sir?" "Yes." It was the voice, that awful voice, like judgment. Her face turned green again. Her eyes fluttered. Dr. Armstrong said sharply, "Where's the brandy?" Rogers had put it down on the little table. Someone handed it to the doctor, and he bent over the gasping woman with it. "Drink this, Mrs. Rogers." She drank, choking a little and gasping. The spirit did her good. The color returned to her face. She said, "I'm all right now. Just give me a turn." Rogers said quickly, "Of course it did. It gave me a turn, too. Fair made the drop that tray. Wicked lies. It was I'd like to know." He was interrupted. It was only a cough, a dry cough, but it was the effect of stopping him in full cry. He stared at Mr. Justice Wargrave, and the latter coughed again. Then he said, "Who put that record on the gramophone? Was it you, Rogers?" Rogers' cry, "I didn't know what it was. Before God, I didn't know what it was, sir. If I'd had, I'd never done it." The judge said dryly, "That is probably true, but I think you better explain, Rogers." The butler wiped his face with a handkerchief. He said earnestly, "I was just obeying orders, sir, that's all." "Whose orders?" "Mr. Owen's." Mr. Justice Wargrave said, "Let me get this quite clear. Mr. Owen's orders were what exactly?" Rogers said, "I was to put a record on the gramophone. I'd find the record in the drawer, and my wife was to start the gramophone when I'd gone into the drawing-room with the coffee tray." The judge murmured, "A very remarkable story." Rogers cried, "It's the truth, sir. I swear to God it's the truth. I didn't know what it was, not for a moment. It had a name on it. I thought it was just a piece of music." Wargrave looked at Lombard. "What was on the title?" Lombard nodded. He grinned suddenly, showing his white pointy teeth. He said, "Quite right, sir. It was entitled Swan Song." This is where I'm actually going to stop, and I'm going to make another separate video about Section 3. So go to that video to hear the rest of Section 3.